if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat box. And only the hosts will be able, and that's Marcia, who will be able to respond to those. We did receive some questions from Margaret, which most of them will be answered, we believe, during the presentation. So my name is Josephine McNeil, and some of you know, I know, and some of you I don't. As Marcy indicated, there are some folks on the call who are from UCAN. And then we have our guests from DFUN. And the genesis for this presentation came from an invitation that I received, in which I shared with UCAN, of which I am, along with Marcy and Bart Lloyd, the co-chairs. And one of our functions as an organization is to educate people about housing affordability in Newton. So there are going to be three presenters this evening, myself, Josephine McNeil, Larissa Hordensky, and Marcy Johnson. Next slide. So as I mentioned, UCAN has a mission, which is to educate the citizens of Newton about the need for housing in our city. And this organization was formed about 20 years ago as a housing advocacy organization. And so we have, over the years, provided educational forums and in some instances advocated for certain housing programs and policies. And one of our significant achievements was we were one of the organizers for the adoption of the Preservation Act, which was approximately about 17 or 18 years ago. Next slide, please. So we're going to start off with just a few terms, which might be beneficial as we go through the presentation. I'm sure many of you you're familiar with the term affordable when people talk about affordable housing. But I think a good way to think of affordable is affordable with a capital A, which is a term that is defined by HUD, the Housing and Urban Development. And it's for people whose incomes are below 80%. And then there's affordable with a small a, which is what you hear used constantly. And I think it creates a certain amount of confusion for people. So I would suggest that you just think about when people say, affordable, who is it affordable to? And as I said, it's the 80% and below is the HUD definition. And that's the one that we primarily go by if you're talking about to people who are in the housing world. And then you'll hear the term AMI, which stands for Area Median Income. Again, that's set by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And what they mean by area median income is that they actually look across the country and they look at the fair market rents for a particular locality. And so they have set up these areas, and so that Newton is in the Boston, I think go through the Rhode Island area. And so that's the area median income that we go by. Inclusionary zoning is a term that's used by a city to mandate that a certain number of units be designated as affordable, small a, by a developer who's seeking a special permit. So the various housing developments you might have heard about in Newton and you've seen now, for instance, on Austin Street, there's the development, and then there's the new development on the corner of Washington and Walnut Street. And both of those properties contain inclusionary units. And then again, the term housing subsidy. You'll hear people use the term subsidized housing. And what that means is that there's some amount of money that is given to the tenants who live in the rental units to help them to pay their rent. And so one type of a subsidy is a Section 8 voucher, which is issued by the federal government. And again, those are for people whose incomes are below the affordable, capital A, 80% in income. Next slide.
Okay, so I think, Josephine, that you're going to turn this over to me.
Yep.
So a couple of things while we're still on this slide. Later in the presentation, we'll be going over in a little more detail around inclusionary zoning as part of zoning ordinances here in Newton. And we'll get into a little bit more information about area median income, okay? So I just wanted to, if you're a little confused, a lot of people get confused on that. So let me see. Okay. So I just want you to know, and I want you to be proud of us, and we can get a raucous round of applause when we're done, because Josephine and I've been on the call since 7 o'clock preparing, making sure we know how to do the technology correctly. So I'm not a guru on Zoom. Been learning by the seat of my pants. So one of the pleasures I actually had in preparing for this meeting tonight is we thought it would be good for you to understand what affordable housing actually exists in Newton today. So we looked at, I've got a couple of slides here. And so we're looking at the organization that sponsors the housing. What is the residential focus? So housing for whom? And then what kind of housing do they provide? So we're going to start with Pathway to Possible. You might have heard the acronym of P2P. Actually, Brenda Newell, Ward 6 counselor, is the executive director, if you've had the pleasure of meeting her. They provide residential and independent living for people with cognitive and development disabilities. They have 6 homes in Newton, Wellesley. They staff these homes 24/7, plus they provide services to people who live outside of those homes. I actually have a pen pal who lives in one of the other housing developments here in Newton. Then we have the Price Center, and this is residential and habilitation for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities or differences. And they have 6 homes, and they provide support to independent and residents who live there. Well-known, well-run organization. Second Step, one of my favorites, right? I live at the Trio. When Josephine talked about a building where you have inclusionary zoning, my husband and I moved into the Trio in August. Second Step has a congregate living home here in this neighborhood, and they have one other house in Newton, and they provide transitional housing for children, families, women, men who have suffered from domestic violence. And B'nai B'rith, and they have a couple of houses. I think one of their main ones is on Commonwealth Ave near Boston College. And they have, it's for families, seniors, members of, workforce housing and so forth, which people who have a middle to lower income. So on this, just as we will be providing you with handouts, and so you're going to get this chart with a little more information about each one of these organizations as well. Two Life, am I correct in saying this, Josephine, they used to be JCC? Is that what they're?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So they really service older adults, senior citizens. They have the Coleman House, and then one of the ones, and if you follow any of the Community Preservation Act funding, Golda Meir House has been up because they've increased their capabilities in expanding their housing. Then we have the Newton Community Development Foundation, or NCDF, and they provide a variety of housing for people with different mental health issues, low-income seniors, and families. For those who live in West Newton, you may know the Warren House. It used to be the Warren Junior High School right there on Washington Street. That's one of their buildings. And those of you who may be from the Newton Center area, the Weeks House, you also may have played soccer as youth, elementary or junior high school, middle school, because those fields are typically used for soccer games. So they provide housing for a variety of different folks, and plus I think they have some also for some market rate. Actually, worked with a woman who lived there. Then we have Can Do, Citizens for Affordable Housing in Newton Development Organization. And this is an organization that Josephine started and recently retired from as being executive director. And like with NCDF, they provide those housing is for people ranging from transitional housing, so folks who move out of Second Step. So if you think about Second Step, a person who's suffering from domestic violence, their first is they get out of the situation and they kind of go into a hiding type, very secure living situation. Then hence the next step is Second Step, where they learn how, to kind of get their life back together, and then they move on. And so Can Do provides housing for folks in kind of basically their third step. They also have houses for people with developmental disabilities, but they also have a main focus of people for very low income families. And there's a house on Commonwealth Ave in Auburndale for veterans, the Veterans House. And it's 48 units in total. Most of them are affordable in perpetuity, so that they have an income limit for people who live there. And Josephine, since this is your world, is there anything you'd like to add to that section?
No, not really. I think you made the point, which is the main point, which is that we serve people whose incomes are below 50% and below, and many people whose incomes are at 30% and below, which is extremely low income.
Then in the handout, there will be a list of all of the Can Do House. One of the differences between NCDF and Can Do is NCDF has, if you think about the Warren House or Weeks House, or what's the one, Josephine, up in Newton Center there?
Castleman
House. So those are apartment buildings, but the houses that Can Do has predominantly, two-family house, a cluster housing. So they're smaller, so there's more of them, and they're spread out in various parts of the city so that they get that neighborhood feel. And then there's the Newton Housing Authority, and these are affordable rental housing for elderly, and then families, and then folks who are disabled. And these are funded by state and federal programs. So I don't like the term, but more people think of it as public housing. And there's ones there's one up in Nonantum on Jackson Road. There's one right across from the old Horace Mann School. So some of those, so they tend to be, you know, it's a housing development. So, okay, and I think that covers that. So we'll go into a little more detail around some of these terms when we get to some of the zoning. So I'm going to turn this back to Josephine and to talk about some of the real underlying, some of the questions that were sent to us by Maggie as kind of what policies and things, kind of the underlying processes, policies that govern affordable housing. And so Josephine's going to be going over these what we're calling housing resources, and she'll get into a little more depth. And again, we have a handout that we will be sending to you folks, which, so you don't have to take lots of notes, and explains them in a little more detail, okay? All right, let's see if I can get that. All right, there you go, Josephine.
Okay. So as Marcy said, we're calling these housing resources, and there are basically, I'm going to be going through some of the financing, some of the infrastructure, for lack of a better word, that are important to trying to create affordable housing in the city. And so the only financial resource that comes from the taxpayers of Newton is the Community Preservation Act. Now, I think I mentioned the Community Preservation Act earlier, and it was legislation that was passed about 18 years or so ago by the Massachusetts legislature, where the legislature said to communities that you can vote to place a surcharge on your real estate taxes for 3 purposes, one of which was housing. And the housing for the Community Preservation Act, though, goes up to 100% of the area median income, and it's called community housing. The other 2 usage of community preservation is for historic preservation, so that if there are buildings which are old, and as you know, Newton is full of old buildings, and the historic buildings are an important part of what makes Newton, Newton. And then the other source is for open space and recreation, so that if there's land that comes available in the city, for instance, I guess it was last year, there was, the city decided that it wanted to purchase some property that had been actually purchased by Boston College, and that it's called Webster Woods, which is up in the area of the college. And the city decided that it wanted to preserve that area as those lands as open space. And so the city actually bonded some of its community preservation funds so that it could purchase the units. The land. Many of CANDO's units were built using community preservation funds. So it's an important financial resources if we want to create affordable housing in the city. The other financial resources come from either the federal government or from the state. There's a program called the Community Development Block Grant Program, which is, the popular name is CDBG. You probably have heard that someplace. And the city of Newton is what's called an entitlement community for certain federal funds for housing and for human services and some other uses. And so because we are a entitlement community, depending upon what Congress allocates for the budget for HUD, there's a certain amount of money that Newton gets for community development block grants, which primarily is used for housing. Some of it is used for curb cuts, for help for folks who are disabled. And then the funds are used for some human service programs. For instance, the Boys and Girls Club gets an allocation of money usually from those funds. Another program that's a federal program is called the HOME program, HOME. And that is a program that, again, Newton, because it's entitlement community, gets a certain amount of those funds, which are used specifically for housing. And those funds can be used to purchase housing. It can be used to rehab housing, and it can even be used for rental assistance. And the city has done that I think for a period of 2 years once, but they haven't really used it very much for that resource, for that usage. Again, home money has gone into some of the CAN-DO projects, because CAN-DO is called a CHODO, Community Housing Development Organization, which the HOME program for communities that receive home funds, they can establish a nonprofit that receives a certain percentage of those funds annually. And they also can receive some operating funds for the organization. So CAN-DO is the City of Newton's CHODO. The other federal resource is the Section 8 program, which is run really by the Housing Authority. So the Housing Authority not only creates housing, but they receive a certain number of housing vouchers, which people can get on a waiting list. And you might be interested to know that the waiting list in Newton is probably like 7 years. So the housing voucher is a main primary resource for much of the housing for a lot of poor people. There aren't enough vouchers, but the city, the housing authority does allocate those. And then the state has another subsidy program, and they have a voucher program that's called the Massachusetts Rental Voucher Program. And usually people refer to them as MRVP vouchers. So there are state agencies that allocate those vouchers. And there are some families in Newton that do have MRVP vouchers. Next slide. And then additional resource we have is what I'll call people power. And there are numerous boards and commissions whose hands touch housing development in the city of Newton. The Department of Planning and Development is the city agency that guides the various housing that occurs in the city. They are the source of advice to the city council, and they work with the city council around special permits and special ordinances that are generated with respect to the housing and other things. But since we're focusing on housing. And then the city has a planning and development board. And that is a board made up of individuals who are appointed by the mayor, and they make certain decisions with respect to and advice with respect to housing and some other issues. But one of their main roles is that they are the body that makes recommendations to the mayor with respect to the federal funds that are received by the city. So, for instance, if Can Do wanted money to create some housing, then the housing office of the Planning and Development Board would receive the request, and then they would make a recommendation to the city, the Planning and Development Board. And if the Planning and Development Board approved of the project, then they would make a recommendation to the mayor. And so the final word on whether or not funding would be provided for the project would be made by the mayor. Then there's an organization of which I am a member called the Newton Housing Partnership. And this is, again, a group of citizens appointed by the mayor who advise the mayor with respect to various housing matters. For instance, and I shouldn't say the mayor, yes, I'm sorry. I'm trying to clarify the difference between the partnership making a decision and who it is that they're advising. We would like to think that we have some influence on the city council, but that isn't always clear. But we definitely have the role of advising the mayor with respect to the housing. So if a project is brought before the planning department, which ultimately say it has to go before the city council for a special permit, then we, the partnership, will receive information about that project, and we will ask questions. Sometimes the developer will come into our meeting and make a presentation, and then we advise on whether or not we think the project is a one that should be approved or accepted by the city council. Again, we are advising the mayor, but the city council also hears about our recommendation. And then there is the Newton Fair Housing Committee, which is another committee that I sit on. And what our role is to make sure that the federal and state fair housing laws are being adhered to, or at the least that the council, whomever is making decisions about housing, are taking into consideration what the fair housing laws are. And then there is the Community Preservation Committee, which again is the committee that was set up to advise and advise the city council on how CPA, Community Preservation Act, funds should be spent. And what usually happens there is that some organization, and sometimes the city itself, will come in and seek funding for housing, for historic preservation, like if there's a city building that they want to preserve, or the open space, which I mentioned earlier. And the presentation is made to the Community Preservation Committee, and they will then make a recommendation to the city council. The city council actually has two separate committees that the council, CPA council's recommendation goes to. And those committees will ultimately make a recommendation to the city council, who will decide whether or not the fund should be allocated. And then lastly, there is another board called the Zoning Board of Appeals, whose involvement with whose involvement with housing is twofold. Number one, they are the body in the city that decides whether or not a variance can be granted and to a property owner. Sometimes people will have property, but the zoning for that particular parcel is such that they can't use their property in the way that they want. And there's a state law that they can use to seek relief so that they can use their property in the way in which they want to. And so there is a Board of Appeals that's set up, made up of people, again, who are, I think I'm right on this, appointed by the mayor. The other role that the Zoning Board of Appeals plays, which is directly related to affordable housing, is that there is a statute in Massachusetts called Chapter 40B, and it's known as a comprehensive permit statute. And that statute says that in a community, if 10% of its housing is not affordable to people whose incomes are at 80% or below, affordable with a big A, or if a certain amount of its area of its land is not used for affordable housing, then a developer can come in and develop housing for that income range, people whose area median income is 80% or below. And then there are certain zoning bylaws that they don't have to adhere to. And so, and the reason that was put in place is because there are many communities in which the zoning ordinances are so prohibitive that housing cannot be built for people whose incomes are at 80% of the area median income. So the ZBA is the board that makes a determination as to whether or not a particular project can get a comprehensive permit. And then finally, we have the elected officials who I've made reference to, and that's the the mayor and the city council. So all of those bodies, persons play a role in creating affordable housing in the city, or I should say creating housing, period. Some focus on affordable housing and others just housing in general. Okay, Marcy.
Okay. So just before I start, in going back to a couple of things that Josephine had to say, is that when we talk about the, and I'm probably going to go a little bit out of order here. I want to talk about the comprehensive permit, and so she explained it, so I can save some time there. But when she was talking about the housing partnership, there was a 40B development on Court Street. Court Street is in Newtonville. It runs from Central to just right by Marty's liquor store on Washington Street. And the Newton Housing Partnership played an immense role in the creation, the formulation of that, what it looked like, how the units were. So that was my first real introduction. I was a Ward 2 at-large alderman at the time. So they do have a great deal of, or can have a great deal of influence, and they really did influence that particular development. So going back to the top, the accessory apartment, you've probably heard about this. There's been some chatter in the last, say, year or so. An accessory apartment can also be termed an in-law apartment. So it's a unit of one or more rooms in a single or a two-family house. It can be in a detached, so someone could have an outbuilding, a garage, and then they add on, say, a second floor. You hear it frequently about a carriage house in some of the older, Victorian houses, or it could be embedded in the house itself. And when we think about those, some of what really regulates the creation or establishment of an accessory apartment in a house is state building code. And one of the biggest ones is you have to have two means of egress for safety purposes. So sometimes that is a very big expense. So you might hear talk about that. Recently, the city council, I think a couple years ago, changed the accessory apartment ordinance to allow creating one within your house. So if you've got think of your structure as a box right now, and you take and put a couple rooms inside that box as an accessory apartment, that now can be done as long as it meets all the Newton and state building codes by right. So there is no special permit needed. So let's hop down to special permit. Special permit means that the petitioner, so your family, wants to do something to their house, in this case an accessory apartment, but they want to do it over the garage. So you have a two-car garage inside, you want to put an apartment there for, grandmama. And so that goes before the city council. And as I think you all know, it's a 24-member council, and it takes 2/3 vote to pass. So that can be a high bar for, and it's any special permit. So it's not just, accessory apartments, any special permit that goes before, that is brought to the city council takes a 2/3 vote. And so you may have heard of Governor Baker's Housing Choice Bill. And that is one of the things, major things in that bill, and I'm not sure where it stands, I think it's with the budget, is that it would allow cities and towns to have multifamily housing, which all require special permits right now, which means you go before that 24-member board to get approval, would be by right. And what by right means is that you're following all of the ordinances. So, whatever, setback. And I know some of you have been attending the zoning redesign meetings, talking about front and side setbacks and various, shapes in size of lot size and, all those sorts of things. So if what somebody wants to do to their home or their building, and it follows all the ordinances and inspectional services does a big check, then you can build it. If you need variances, and depending on what you need, you may go to the Zoning Board of Appeals that Josephine mentioned, or you file for a special permit. So those are the kind of differences. And so a 40B is the Zoning Board of Appeals. If you want to do something else like multifamily housing, accessory apartment that's exterior to your house, then that is a special permit before the City Council. Inclusionary zoning, I just need to find my little chart. So it's interesting on inclusionary zoning, that's gone through a lot of iterations over the years, and I can say that Ms. McNeil got me involved in that when I first joined the Board of Aldermen back in 2000. And as of January 1st of 2021, buildings such as I'm living here, and I live in the Trio, that the developer of a building of this sort will be required to have 20% of the apartments as affordable. That means that 15% would be that between that 50% and 80% AMI. So for a household size, 50% AMI, that the most recent chart on the city's website is $47,400 for a family of two. So 30% is $28,450. 100% is $90,640. So that gives you some guidelines there. Then, so the tier one is be 15%. That's that 50 to 80%. And 80%, I'm sorry, was at 71,000. And then tier two, an additional 5% for that total 20. Right now, if somebody petitions in the year 2020, that 17.5% of the units need to be affordable. And I would encourage you in the handout that we will send to you to really read the inclusionary zoning ordinance, because it's very important, for instance, that the apartments, so if the apartments are equal or relatively equal, so the same appliances, they look the same, they're not all in the back of the building, they could have a nice view, so that they blend in along with all of the other market rate unit tenants. So then mixed use and transit oriented. A lot of talk recently about mixed use. When Josephine was talking about inclusionary zoning, she mentioned Austin Street. That was the start of kind of mixed use. The Board of Aldermen, working with the planning department, created a mixed use 4 zone. And that was what was used for the Austin Street development and the Trio. And transit oriented is the one that's being used for Riverside down on Grove Street. And that was approved not all that long ago, I think. And that has a number of units, and I don't remember how many, but so those are the 2 there. And then special permit, I think I touched on all of those, I think. Okay. All right, so I'm going to turn this over now to Larissa, and she joined us a little bit late, so you haven't seen her yet. So Larissa is going to take you through the kind of, so what could happen next? And then we will look at other questions you might have that we did not answer from ones that were sent in. Larissa, you there?
Yes, hi, everybody. I don't think I need the slide right now, Marcy.
Okay. So you want me to stop sharing?
Yeah.
Okay.
This way I can see everybody.
Okay.
Okay. Hi there. Okay, so let's talk a bit about your next steps. And actually, have people been putting questions in the chat? Do we have any questions?
Right now, no. But they can, at this time, we also can, people could raise their hands either.
Yeah, okay, so why don't we just open up the floor to questions?
Anybody?
Harry. Harry.
Maggie? Oh, did you have a question, Maggie?
Harry, go first, and then I'll go.
You're very gracious, thank
Oh,
you.
fine.
Yeah, I guess I was just gonna ask, sort of thinking broadly, I don't want to like throw that out there, but just when we're looking at affordable housing as developments, like as still housing developments, when they're going through all the sort of the hoops that like these various groups that the city government has to observe them, like how is it seen similar to, and I guess separate than another housing development? You guys sort of touched on that, but I was just wondering if there are like any sort of subtle nuances when the various boards are looking over developments. Do they see it more so as like something separate than a housing development when they think about it as affordable, or are they still considering all the aspects of it as like a building regardless?
So if you're talking about, say, when the city council looked at Austin Street, for instance, right?
Sure.
They look at it, so I can talk about that one. They look as an entity. So it is Austin Street, that particular development, and within all the aspects, environmental, transportation, housing, neighborhood impact, underground wiring, I mean, everything. So if you look at what comes out of it, it's now called a council order because it lists all the things that the developer will do in working with the city. So if you think about Austin Street, they have that plaza there that people now they've blocked that off. They also contributed money to the upgrading of Walnut Street between the bridge and basically the senior center. So that's all, and it's a very complex document, but it's really looked at as a whole. And the ZBA would do the same thing for a comprehensive permit. Josephine, you want to add anything else?
No, I would just say that I would recommend, and I think Larissa is going to talk about this, that the best way for you to really get a feel for the process is to become a part of the process. All of these projects have public hearings. So if you follow them, and now it's really easy because everything's on Zoom. It used to be you had to go to City Hall 4 nights a week. Now you can get on Zoom and
sit in church pews.
you can follow every project. And I would recommend that you do that. Yeah. Maggie had a question too.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could go over what the comprehensive / permit / 40B was again, because I think I just missed it.
Oh, okay. With 40, as I said, with 40B, the city has to have a certain percentage of its housing that's affordable, large A, to people whose incomes are below 80% of the area median income. If they don't, and Newton does not, then the developer can come in and present their proposal to the ZBA, and they are able to, the ZBA can make a decision, but they don't have to look at every aspect of the zoning code. Like they don't have to have a certain setback. They don't have to have, a certain side yard setback. The only thing that they're really supposed to consider are health and safety factors. And as long as the project fits within health and safety guidelines, then the permit should be granted. What is unique about the ZBA, which I didn't mention, the comprehensive permit, is that if the ZBA rejects the proposal, the petitioner, developer, has a right to appeal the decision, because sometimes the zoning board of appeals, and Newton isn't very bad, doesn't do this. In fact, most comp permits that come before Newton ZBA over the years have passed. But sometimes the ZBA will put conditions on the project that make it financially infeasible to build. And if they do that, then when they make the appeal to what's called the Housing Appeals Court, the Housing Appeals Court will deny those conditions that the developer has put on the property. Is that, you got it now?
Yes, thank you.
When we can always come back to it, at another time.
So an important thing, Maggie, also is because of the zoning privileges that a 40B allows a developer, because they're doing 20 to 25% affordable units. They don't have to give back to the city as much. So the things that the city council can demand, and I use the word demand, sometimes ask, but demand of a developer, are far more extensive than what you would get. And the city council has far more control over the building and what it looks like and this, that, and the other thing than the ZBA has over the 40B. And sometimes 40Bs are not welcome by neighborhoods, and that's where the one on Court Street, it's a lovely building now, and if you go down it, as I said, it's between Central Ave and right behind Amarty's, that the Newton Housing Partnership was very helpful in working with neighbors and in influencing the developer and so forth. So that's kind of the difference, is a level of control. So the city council would rather have a special permit than a 40B. Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, Courtney?
Sure. I think Nora, you're motioning for me to do my question first. So, so I guess I have a few questions, but I'll try to kind of like squeeze it into just 2 questions because I know some more people have questions. So my first question is, it seems like there's just like a huge ecosystem of organizations working on these issues. And it was really interesting to hear how far back that goes. So I guess the first thing I was wondering was, how have you sort of seen like waxing and waning of interest in of Newton residents in these kinds of issues over time? And then one organization I think that you may not have gone over was Engine 6, and I'm a little confused like where they fit into kind of this picture of ecosystem of organizations. And then my second question, and it's okay if you want to pick and choose which question you want. My second question was about developers and how I feel like people have a really negative view of developers, and I'm curious to hear about if people have encountered that like we have kind of the housing that we need in Newton, but that it's just not affordable, or is it really that like we do need someone like a developer to bring more units so that then we have more units that we can make affordable? And I know that is probably not like a clear-cut answer, and in different scenarios it's, you know, different I guess dynamics kind of at play, but I was curious about that.
Who wants to answer?
I'll take a little bit of stab. I'm going to go with I'll take the developer one. So yeah, I mean, a couple of things with developers. And I'm going to talk about just in affordable housing space. I'm not going to talk about big mansions or any of that stuff, because that's a whole different thing. The funding of these inclusionary units So so they have a lesser, because of the, income for those people is lower. Then the rents for all the other units are subsidizing the rent of that unit. So, and I don't know, I think Josephine sent something out about funding, affordable housing funding, that somebody had asked about. And so the Massachusetts Housing Partnership offered an hour-long training session about the funding. And actually at the time that Riverside was being built, they offered a mini training. There was a consultant working on that. I'm not even going to begin to go there, Courtney. It's very complex. But because of that subsidizing the lower, the inclusionary units, and then the developer needs to make money. And so a lot of people think that that's all the developer is to make money, and they get very critical. So it's a very unbalanced view. So depending on the developer and his or her contribution to the community or whatever, but yeah, they see a developer who lives in $1 million, or well, I can't say that, that's the average house price in Newton now, but a multi-million-dollar house, whatever. But you have to look at the development, you have to look at the person. And the other piece was the waning of interest and waxing and waning. I think interest in housing began with Austin Street, in my opinion, because now we took a parking lot and everybody was, the world was going to come to an end because we were changing a parking lot into a housing development. And there was a lot of consternation. And the developers, Dinosaur, I think it was Dinosaur, Scott Aran, got the, he has a 100-year lease on the property at a very low rate. So there was a lot of consternation about that. So you have that about the developers making money off affordable housing. The other piece is just a reminder is you have very few units, if any, in some of these developments for that lowest level. So that's not necessarily your vehicle and your silver bullet to really increase housing for people who need it the most. Josephine, did you want to talk about that a little bit?
No, I think there are developers and they're developers. But I think you made, like it or not, and most people really do like it. We live in a capitalistic society, and most people want to make money. And I don't know if you, in the training the other day, I think they might have alluded to it a little bit. If you think about how long it takes for a project to go through the process to be approved, the amount of money that developers have to spend before that decision is made, and as Marcy mentioned, and then the city wants the developer to pay for all these different mitigations. And if you put it all together, I don't think it's fair to, and people use the term greedy, to use the term. And then I also think that there's the level of affordability that you can expect for a developer to reach has to be reasonable. They're in business to make money. And if people truly care about deeply affordable housing, then we as a community need to be willing to pay the costs in order to provide that housing. And it means, is what I say to people all the time, no matter whether it's, for housing, for the cost or whatever, that we all have to give up something. Nothing comes free. In some cases, it means you might have to have a few more cars on the street. You might have to sit in traffic for 10 minutes more. And I don't know how many of you know how serious a problem homelessness is in this country, and including in Massachusetts, a real serious problem. And when people complain to me about, we can't have that many units because it's going to create traffic, I say to people, is it worth it to you to sit in traffic for 10 minutes so a child can have a home? And it's just, it's as simple as that. We have to be willing, and I'm sorry if I'm preaching, but when you ask those kinds of questions, this is what you get from me. Then we have to say, then we're ready to give up something. We can't have all these liberal views, but we're not willing to give up anything to make those views real in people's lives.
The other piece that was asked was about Engine 6. What we went over were the city, because we're talking about what does the city as the government offer. So that's why we didn't talk about other organizations that might advocate. So we were looking at who are driving the policies, driving the decisions, and all that.
And just, can we just say a quick word about the role of Engine 6?
Sure, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to ask you to do it.
Oh. Well, actually, Engine 6 started, I don't know if you know the genesis of that, and it was around Mayor Warren not wanting to grant CDBG funds for the creation of housing for homeless at the old Engine 6 fire station on, I think it's Beacon, right near Washington. So that's how it started. So they are, they started out with that, and actually additional units to replace what was not done there are being put in the Golda Meir House. And they're an advocacy group, and they are a very active and influential advocacy group, and it's growing. And some of you, I've seen your names at some of the meetings, so I know you're getting involved in that. So they do not have housing, but the organizations that I listed out are organizations that actually do housing of people. Engine 6 is an advocacy. So if the Newton Community Development Foundation, or Can Do, wanted to do more development, and they're petitioning either the ZBA for a comprehensive permit or the City Council for a special permit, Engine 6 would advocate for those. That's the differentiation. Does that help?
Yeah, that was all really helpful background.
Good,
Thanks so
good.
much.
You're welcome.
Do we have time for one more question?
Yeah.
I think,
Marcy, somebody's waiting to come in too, if you can let somebody else
I
in.
think Nora had a question, right?
I have a whole list of questions, but I could
Oh,
ask
you
one
can,
of them.
Nora, you can send those to us, and we'll get back to you on that.
That is
Okay.
so nice of you. Yeah, I can ask one of them unless there's somebody else who has a question before me. I'm also willing to defer and wait. Does anybody else have a question? Otherwise, I'll ask one. Okay. So I'm confused about the discourse around housing. If you don't know anything, which I know very little, it kind of seems like there's a pro-development, pro-affordable housing camp, and then there's, the right-sized people who don't want affordable housing, but they're also somehow, yeah, I don't get it exactly, but now I'm understanding that there's a lot more nuance among the group of folks that are wanting affordable housing. And I'm interested in understanding the nuances on the pro-affordable housing side. If you could speak to that a little bit.
Well, Nora, I think the purpose of this is to provide people with fundamental facts.
Okay.
It's not our role to try to influence people's opinions with this. I think when people have approached me and asked me, started talking to me about housing, it became very clear that there was so much basic knowledge that people did not have And that if you want to advocate for something, then you need to, get some basic facts. So we not, with all due respect, we are not going to go, sort of go down that road with you.
Fair
okay?
enough, fair enough.
But Larissa, in fact, why don't we let you, because it's 8:40 and we're supposed to end up, why don't you,
Okay, yes, well, I just wanted to wrap up and you're probably wondering, what are your next steps? What can you do now? Because we've thrown a lot of names and organizations at you. Some of them have confusingly similar names. And if you could spend some time learning more about the housing resources and organizations that provide affordable housing and what affordable means in this context, that would be really helpful, and that would clarify a lot of things for you. And the handouts that we're providing are going to give you links that you can go to and actually research some of these. And is it okay, Maggie, if I send all these documents to you for distribution?
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, fine. And so what can you do? Research, read about, learn about some of these organizations, and then what? I mean, sign up for news and updates from the ones that interest you, attend their meetings. You can join a lot of these organizations. For instance, UCAN meets monthly. The next meeting is of January 13th at 8:30 a.m. If any of you would like to come to a UCAN meeting, that would be great. Find out more about what the city council and the various committees do. And in particular is the land use committee. That one is particularly relevant to housing. And are you aware of Amy Sangiolo's weekly newsletter? Okay.
Yeah, I went to school with George since preschool, so we're familiar.
Yeah, okay. And because that gives you she sends it out like every Monday usually, and there you have a list of all the upcoming city council meetings and the committee and subcommittee meetings, the various board meetings. Josephine talks about people power, okay? And so that's what all these various boards and partnerships and committees are. There's the Newton Department of Planning and Development and the Planning and Development Board. They're not exactly the same thing. And there's the Newton Housing Partnership. Now, Josephine is a member of that. She's also a member of the Fair Housing Committee or the Zoning Board of Appeals. They all have meetings which are open to the public. Very easy to attend now with Zoom. And obviously one person can't do it all. So if you're interested in working as a group, split up some of these organizations. Everyone choose to attend a meeting or two, and by the time we meet again for our next session, like on January 19th, you'll certainly be a bit more conversant about all these organizations and what they do, and we'll be able to delve a little bit more deeply into all of these topics. So today's goal was really just to introduce you to the variety of types of housing and the funding and housing resources available right here in Newton. And so we'll meet again on January 19th, 7 p.m. By then we should be able to have a more interactive discussion, and then we'll wrap up on the 26th of January, our third meeting at 7 p.m. And I probably don't have to tell you that there's even more pressure on affordable housing these days due to the pandemic. And there's even more of a demand. Josephine mentioned over a 7-year waiting list for housing vouchers, and that's only going to worsen with the current situation. So we'll see you all on the 19th then, and I will be forwarding materials to Maggie. And if anybody has any questions, please get in touch with me or Marcy or Josephine.
Okay. Happy holidays, everybody. Stay
Thank you
safe,
so much.
stay healthy.
Thank you so much. This
Thanks
was
so
really
much. This was
helpful.
great.
All righty.
Thank
And
you.
Nora, send us your other questions, okay? All right?
Thank
Great.
you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.